Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a really profound, frankly dark chapter in American history. We're looking at a time when the laws on the books completely crossed the line into absolute moral injustice. As we unpack this, I really want you to put on your critical thinking caps and step into the shoes of the people who actually lived through this era. Let's get right into it.
Right out of the gate, I've got a question for you. Would you obey a law if it literally forced you to do something you knew, deep down, was completely evil? Imagine waking up one day and finding out the government is legally requiring you to participate in a system of outright cruelty. And if you refuse, you go straight to jail. Well, that's not just some hypothetical movie plot. That was the terrifying everyday reality for millions of Americans back in the 1800s. Keep those moral stakes in mind for everything we're about to cover today.
Here's our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to define these laws of moral injustice, compare the 1793 and 1850 acts, look at the direct threat to freedom, explore the abolitionist resistance, and finally discuss why education requires true morality.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, Laws of Moral Injustice.
So the Fugitive Slave Acts were federal laws giving slaveholders the legal power to capture escaped enslaved people. But here is the absolute kicker. This applied even in free states. Seriously, imagine you're living in a northern state where slavery has been completely outlawed. You think, hey, my state took a stand. But no, these federal laws reached right across state borders, dragging free states into the harsh enforcement of slavery. It basically dumped the issue right on the doorsteps of people who wanted absolutely nothing to do with it.
To really wrap our heads around the massive outrage these laws sparked, we've got to look at the moral mindset of the time. Think about Proverbs 31:8. Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. For a lot of citizens back then, this wasn't just some nice quote on a wall. It was a deeply held command. So when the government told them they had to turn a blind eye, or worse, actively help capture human beings, it directly violated their core biblical morality. That intense spiritual friction is exactly what fueled the massive outrage against these acts.
Moving right along to Section 2, comparing 1793 and 1850.
The escalation between these two laws is staggering, honestly. The original 1793 Act was already highly controversial because it let slaveholders cross into free states to capture alleged runaways. That alone totally upended the idea of state-level control over laws. But then came the 1850 version, part of the Compromise of 1850, and it took things to a shocking new level. It legally forced everyday citizens to help with captures. If you were caught helping a runaway, you were looking at a massive $1,000 fine, which was a fortune back then, and a solid 6 months in jail. On top of that, it explicitly denied accused fugitives the right to even testify on their own behalf in court. Basically, the 1850 law completely criminalized moral opposition to slavery. If you tried to do the right thing, boom, you are a criminal.
Which brings us to Section 3, a direct threat to freedom.
Now here is an absolutely crucial point. This wasn't just a threat to folks who had escaped. Free African Americans, people born free, living their entire lives in the North, were suddenly living under this constant, agonizing threat of kidnapping. Because remember, under that 1850 law, an accused person couldn't testify to prove their freedom. So a slave catcher could literally just point to a free person, claim they were a runaway, and drag them south. There was virtually zero legal protection. Just imagine that daily terror. Walking down the street, knowing that at any second you could be snatched and sold into bondage, and the law would actively silence your defense.
As you can guess, these laws poured gasoline on the fire of sectionalism, that intense regional divide in the U.S. From the northern perspective, this felt like an aggressive attack on their state's sovereignty and their moral values. They deeply resented being turned into unpaid slave catchers for the South. But flipping to the southern perspective, these laws were seen as a totally necessary constitutional protection of their, quote-unquote, property rights. They argued that federal laws simply had to force the North to respect their economic system. So you have this immense tension between states' rights and federal authority, and it just kept widening the crack that would eventually split the whole nation in two.
Let's look at how people fought back in Section 4, the abolitionist resistance. When faced with that brutal 1850 law, abolitionists didn't back down. No, they doubled down. Resistance became an absolute moral duty. First off, there were these dramatic, sometimes even violent rescues of captured folks right off the courthouse steps, like the famous rescue of Shadrach Minkins up in Boston. Secondly, they used newspapers and books to loudly publicize the cruelty of these laws, making sure nobody could play the "I didn't know" card. And third, they massively expanded the Underground Railroad. This incredible network of safe houses and brave guides worked tirelessly to help enslaved people escape not just to the northern states, but all the way up into Canada, where U.S. federal laws couldn't touch them. They essentially chose to obey a higher moral law over an unjust federal one.
Okay, to really lock this history in, I want you to take a second and reflect on a few questions. 1. What's the real difference between those 1793 and 1850 acts? 2. Why were free African Americans suddenly at such high risk? 3. How did all of this impact North and South relations? 4. What were some specific methods of resistance? And 5. The big philosophical one. How does learning about all this influence your view on blindly obeying laws today? Jot those down and give them some real thought. And that brings us to our final takeaway in Section 5. Education requires true morality.
All of this history connects directly to a core philosophy from the HeroesMart Academy Godly Learners series. Education without morality will hurt. Think about it. The men who drafted that 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, they were highly educated lawyers, brilliant politicians, elite debaters. But honestly, what is the point of being incredibly smart and supposedly educated if you just use that intellect to make choices that hurt people? Being smart without a foundation of biblical morality just creates more sophisticated ways to cause harm. True education absolutely has to be intertwined with a strong moral compass.
You know, Romans 8:6-7 promises peace of mind to everyone who keeps their mind spiritual. And we've seen from history, and probably from our own experience too, that blending your academic education with spiritual mindfulness is what actually brings true, lasting peace of mind. It makes sure that whatever knowledge you gain is used to uplift, protect, and speak up for those who can't speak for themselves, rather than oppressing them.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought to chew on. Will you choose an education guided by biblical morality so you can make choices that heal rather than hurt? The people back in the 1850s had to choose how to use their knowledge and power. Now, it's your turn. Challenge yourself to build a mind that is brilliantly educated, but also deeply moral. Keep learning, keep questioning, and we'll see you in the next explainer.